Okay, let's start off with a few basics. What was your name at birth?
Bob. Robert A. Schiller.
Did you have any nicknames growing up?
Only Bob.
When were you born?
November 8th, 1918.
And where was that?
That was in a hospital in San Francisco, California.
Is that where you grew up?
I did, yes.
What was your father's name?
Dad? Roland E. Schiller.
What did he do?
He had me. He was a man of the cloth.
A tailor?
No, he was cloak and suitor.
What was your mother's name?
Lucille Block, B-L-O-C-K.
And what did she do?
She was a housewife, but before she got married, she taught English and never let me forget it.
Was she very strict with your
Very
family?
strict with English. And my father, who went through the 6th grade, was very poor with English. And she would correct him under her breath whenever he made a mistake. He would say, he don't, she go, doesn't, just to let you know that she knew. And he once came in with my niece. She says, where have you been? He says, to the movies. What'd you see? The King and I. She says, me.
Now, did that influence you at all? As far as writing?
Absolutely. I grew up with words. They were both very funny. They both had great senses of humor and displayed them. And my father, was, for a man who went through the 6th grade, had the basics of wit down pat, brevity being the soul of it, of wit. He was famous for a 2-word joke. My mother once said to him, tell me when you die, you've never mentioned, do you want to be buried or cremated? He said, surprise me. 2 words. Perfect.
So there was a lot of laughter in your household growing
A
up.
lot of laughter. My son once interviewed my father on tape just to get a record of him, and he said, do you believe in longevity? Pardon me, I blew it. Do you believe in reincarnation? My father says, not yet. 2 words.
Did you have any sisters or brothers?
I had a sister, died recently,
What was her name?
Marilyn.
And what kind of hobbies did you have growing up?
Well, I was interested in sports, but I also had a stamp collection, and I used to collect humor magazines. I loved to read humor.
Which ones?
Well, among other things, the California Pelican, the University of California Humor Magazine. In later years, I edited the UCLA Humor Magazine. And college humor and life, not the life that we know now, the life I led. The life of years ago was a humor magazine, and Judge was a humor magazine, but I used to devour them. I loved humor.
Did you write humor as a youngster?
Not until I came down to Los Angeles right after, during the Depression. I went through grammar school in San Francisco and then came down here to junior high. And I was a fish out of water. And I found out that if I wrote humor, that I would be recognized. And that's what propelled me in a ride. I always had a column, a humor column. Junior high, high school, college, in the Army. Always had humor columns.
Now, why did you come down from San Francisco to Los Angeles?
Because my dad went broke and lost his business, and he found work down here, and so we moved down here. It was the Depression was pervasive. Everybody was affected by it. Certainly our family was.
Now, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Older. I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know what kind of writer. I thought maybe I'd like to write movies. So I always wrote. It was just second nature. When I came down here from Northern California, I had a cousin who was also involved in humor and introduced me to the California Pelican and other things. And we used to write funny letters to each other. So in effect, I learned that way because he was quite good. and we were always sending each other funny letters. I wish I still had them.
For the record, what high school did you attend?
LAI.
Did you do well? Were you a good student?
I was a better than average student. I wasn't great. I made the Periclean Society. That was an honor society, yes.
Okay, and from there you went right to UCLA?
Yes, because there was nothing else to do. There were no jobs. It cost 10 cents to go to UCLA on the Wilshire bus, which in those days was a double-decker bus. The upstairs was open. UCLA cost $26 a semester, and that's all I could afford. I had to work for that. So those were tough days, the Depression.
What'd you study?
I was an economics major.
How did you decide on that?
I figured it would be the easiest thing to take. I was not terribly interested in paleontology or any of the other sciences or things like that. I just thought economics, I had to make a living, and maybe that would help me.
When did you graduate?
1939, summer.
What did you do after you graduated?
I got a job in an advertising agency. Norton Simon's uncle, the Simon family were friends with my parents, and his uncle had an agency, and he took me on as an apprentice. But the problem was that he had only one client, and that was a credit dentist. It was Dr. Cowan, your friendly credit dentist. And I was unable to write straight advertising for a credit dentist. I mean, I would write, "come in" before they come out. You know, no, you can't do that. And I was not right for advertising, but at least I was writing. And I knew that I was not cut out to be an advertising man. And then along came the war and saved me. And I was in the service 5 years, both as an enlisted man and as an officer. And I had columns. I wrote, put out newspapers. I had learned to put out newspapers at UCLA. I was on the Daily Bruin. And that was one of the good things that I learned at UCLA. And so it held me in good stead. I wasn't killed, which was a step in the right direction, I suppose.
When were you discharged?
The last day of 45.
I want to ask you, when was the first time you saw television?
I'm trying to think. There certainly wasn't any when I started out in radio. And it crept in, really. And suppose I saw it like everybody else in a storefront. And I suppose I was watching Milton Berle because that's what everybody watched in those days. That's the only thing I really remember. And I told the William Morris office, who were then my agents, I was then a writer, that they'd better get a television department. They said, "What for?" Imagine.
Do you remember who you talked to, who you said that to?
Yes. I said it to my agent, or one of my two agents. Well, it was either Bob Braun, who was hired for the William Morris office because he was tall and it averaged out the rest of the guys, or Phil Weltman, who was my agent in later years. They thought it would blow over. They didn't take it seriously. And the studios looked down their nose at television. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. It was competitive, so they put it down. And actors were not anxious to be in television because they felt it was a step down.
Was it something that you wanted to move to from radio?
Well, it was a natural move from radio to television, yes. It was easier than getting into the studios.
Let's talk about your radio career. You started at Duffy's Tavern?
I did.
How'd you get that job?
When I got out of the Army, there was a friend of mine who informed me that Ed Gardner, who was Archie of Duffy's Tavern and owned the show, would hire anybody for $50 a week and give them a tryout if they had anything to show him that showed that they had any sense of humor. And I had all these columns and so forth in the scrapbook, and I gave it to the agent. The agent gave it to Gardner, and Gardner said he'll give him a chance. So I wrote, I was still in my Army uniform, and I wrote and brought it up to and that's very hard. I found it enormously hard because writing jokes, to be laughed at, to be said instead of to be read, which is what I wrote, is quite a different thing. You're writing to evoke a physical response, a ha ha ha, and the line has to have a lot of muscle. And I didn't quite know how to write jokes, so I faked it and got away with it. And the guys liked it, the two guys who were the head writers, Bill Manhoff and Larry Marks. And they called Ed Gardner in Bel Air and said, I think we found a writer. So Gardner apparently said on the other end of the line, ask him about Sunday. So they said, we go out to his house on Sundays. How are you at pitching? I said, well, I used to play first base. And I didn't know what they meant. They meant pitching jokes. I'd never heard the expression. They told Gardner, and he said, he laughed, and he said, hire the son of a bitch. And they did. And I went on Duffy's Tavern. Over the years, I was hired and fired 4 times.
Can you describe the show for someone who's never heard it, very briefly?
Duffy's Tavern, the trademark was the opening. It was a piano when Irish Eyes Are Smiling, and it would fade down, and the telephone would ring, and he'd say, Archie, the manager, hello, Duffy's Tavern, where the elite meet to eat. Archie, the manager, speaking. Duffy ain't here. Oh, hello, Duffy. He said, I went to the opera last night. I said, what do you mean, did I enjoy it? He said, if you enjoy opera, you ain't getting the most out of it. And there'd be a monologue. He says, went to the ballet last night, Duffy. I don't understand it. He says, a bunch of dames dancing around on their tippy toes. Why don't they just get taller dames? Great jokes, wonderful jokes. And then after the monologue, he would talk about the guest star. There's always a guest star. Do jokes about the guest stars. And then Miss Duffy would come in. And Miss Duffy was we never saw or we never heard Duffy. It was always on the telephone. But Miss Duffy would come down and keep her eye on the cash register. And she was man-hungry, and that was originally Shirley Booth, who was Ed Gardner's wife. Later, there were several other Miss Duffys, at least 6 or 8. And they would do a monologue, and then Clifton Finnegan, who was named after Clifton Fadiman, who was on Information Please and was considered one of the smarter men in the world. Clifton Finnegan was one of the dumbest. Hello, Archie. I went to the beach yesterday. He says, what happened? He says, a lobster bit off one of my toes. He says, no kidding. He says, which one? He says, I don't know. All them lobsters look alike. And jokes like that. So we would do a monologue a dialogue with Finnegan. And then the guests would come in, and there would be pitter and patter, and that was it. That was the show.
What was Ed Gardner like to work with?
Ed Gardner? A lot of things. He was terribly clever and fast. He had and he was also cruel. I mean, he would hire you and fire you at a moment's notice. He would say, Harry, you work with Joe. Sam, you work with Phil. George, there's nobody for you to work with, you're fired. So, and he'd hire you back a couple of weeks. It kept you on your toes and kept your salaries down. One of the great things, he was also very fast on his feet. One of the great things, I used to play golf with him after I worked for him some years after. I called him one morning early to arrange a golf match. And he and his wife had separate bedrooms. And he picked up the phone and I'm talking to him, arranging the date. And his wife, Simone, picks up the intercom without a hello, excuse me, or anything like, honey? Oh, hi, Poopy. Honey, would you tell Cook that I'm ready for breakfast? Yeah, I'll do that, honey. And when you're finished, why don't you come in? Yeah, I'll do that, honey. And I'm open mouthed. I said, Ed, is she always that sexy in the morning? He says, well, Bob, that's the difference between radio and television. I mean, that's a wonderful joke.
Now, how long did you remain on the show?
Off and on, at least 4 seasons.
Let's touch on a few of the other radio shows that you worked on. You worked on the Abbott and Costello show.
Briefly, yeah, that was an unhappy experience. I never got to meet them. We worked on that show for only 7 weeks, and we worked ahead of the season, and they read our scripts. The head writer, Park Levy, who later created December Bride, took them in, and they didn't like them, and they fired everybody. So that was I got fired a lot. But in those days, everybody did. It was part of the course.
You also worked on Sweeney and March.
Right, that was an interesting experience. Hal March, who later became the Toastmaster of $64,000 Question, and Bob Sweeney, who later became a director. Both terrific guys. And that was a wonderful show. It was never sponsored. It was a radio show put on by CBS up and down the coast. Never got a sponsor. In fact, 2 of the writers on the show, Bill Davenport and Frank Fox, wanted to put up the money themselves because they were so fond of the show. And Manny Mannheim, who was the producer of the show, took me aside after some weeks on the show, and he said, give you some advice, kid. He says, get out of the business. I said, why? He says, you're too nice. Translation, I can't write. But I didn't. And I worked on a number of shows.
You also worked on the Mel Blanc show in '47.
Well, that was a terrible show. Mel Blanc. He has a wonderful voice, but not a very good comedian. But that was an unhappy experience because my partner, I hate to say this because he's no longer with us, my partner then knifed me. He said, I can't work with him. He blah, 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 whatever he said. Not a nice thing to do to your partner.
What was his name?
I don't want to say.
Then you worked on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet.
I did that. That was fun. I enjoyed that. And then one day, I had a 13-week deal. Pardon me. And one day, Ozzie took me aside and he said, Bob, he says, we're not going to pick up your option. I said, why? Can you tell me why? So I was curious, trying to learn. He says, yes. He says, Harriet thinks we should have a woman's voice on the show.
Harriet Nelson.
Harriet Nelson, his wife. And I said, do you mind my asking, who does she have in mind? She says, Selma Diamond. I said, you're getting Selma, you got the wrong man. So they hired Selma, and she didn't last very long.
What kind of writing did you do on that show?
Comedy writing. It was Ozzie and Harriet on radio was, I think, the best sitcom on radio. That and The Aldrich Family. They were the prototypes of sitcoms, but they were awfully good. They weren't just joke. They were stories, and they had character and well done. Ozzie was quite remarkable. He was a band leader, as was Desi, and both of whom had great similarities. Besides marrying good actresses, they learned every aspect of the business, every aspect: writing, production, direction, editing, costuming, the whole thing. They knew everything. They made it their business.
Then you worked on the Jimmy Durante show.
The last gasp of the Jimmy Durante radio show, yes. Did that, and it went off the air. Gary Moore was on that show.
How closely did you work with Durante on that?
Not closely. In those days, the radio guy, the star would come in 1 or 2 days and do his show, and you never really got to chum around with him or meet him, and so forth. Jimmy was very pliable, very pleasant, and very funny.
How did he treat his writers?
He treated them very well. He had very little contact with us, and it was done through a producer whose name was Phil Cohan. But he'd come in, he'd be very pleasant, nice guy.
In 1952, you worked on another popular radio show, December Bride.
Yes, I did. I had gone to New York and gone into television. I came back and went into December Bride, did the last year of that show, radio. That was also Park Levy. Park Levy, I'm always amused by that name. It sounds like a metropolitan housing project for Jews. I live at the Park Levy.
Now, in the early 50s, you began in television.
That's right.
How did that happen?
Well, you have a lot of tape. I can answer that. I had just become a father, and I wasn't doing well in radio. It was moving. There was no more radio out here, and television was coming in. And I figured I wasn't making a living, and my father-in-law had passed away, and he was the West Coast representative for a company which he helped found that sold manufactured house coats. House coats are 99 cents retail. Wholesale are free, I think. So, and they offered me a job, the two brothers that lived in the East. So I went back to New York, and one of the brothers came down from Providence, Rhode Island, where the factory was. And the inside man lived in New York, and they had an interview with me. But before the interview, pardon me, I had lunch with all the guys who had gone to Puerto Rico with Ed Gardner on Duffy's Tavern. And we had a reunion, and they said, what are you doing back here? I said, I'm getting out of the business. They were all very envious. I said, well, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to get in with my father-in-law's business. They were very envious of that, getting out of the business, so forth. So I went to there was an agent that I had by the name of Harvey Orkin, who is considered by many as the funniest man who ever lived. He's no longer alive. He was Richard Burton's agent, among other things. But he knew everybody. We were all friends. And he was with the William Morris office at the time. And he said, you're going to love being on the road. I was going to be on the road. He says, I was on the road when I got out of the Army, he said. And he said, I told the porter to let me off somewhere between Boise and Pocatello. I don't remember where. And he did. And it was 4 a.m, and they let me off, and it was there I was with my steamer trunk, and I waited for the telegraph office to open, and I told them to get their damn steamer trunk. But you will love it. He says, you're cut out for that kind of work. So I said, don't try and talk me out of it. And I said, I owe my family a chance to live, and I owe myself a chance to make a living. So I had the appointment with the brothers, my uncles, my wife's uncles, and they offered me, I think, $75 a week, and I'd be on the road 9 months of the year, and I'd have everything west of Tulsa and Salt Lake. So I called Harvey. I said, no, I'm not changing my mind, but if something should turn up, I would be interested in hearing about it. I figured I could do better than $75 a week. So he called, and the next day he called me and he said, all right, he says, you got 3 shows. I said, what? He says, yeah, you're going to do the 4-star review. You're going to do, there were 4 stars, Danny Thomas, Ed Wynn, Jimmy Durante, and Jack Carson. And I was going to do the Danny Thomas and the Ed Wynn shows, and also the daily Gary Moore show. I said, how'd you do that? He says, it was easy. He says, in the William Morris office, I had these cubicles, and I'd walk from one to the other, and they were always in trouble. It was, the beginning of television. And I would say, if we could only get Schiller, and I'd take 2 steps, and a guy would grab me by the shoulder and say, why can't we get Schiller? They'd never heard of me. But if they can't get you, you must be valuable. I said, haven't you heard? He's getting out of the business. He said, you call yourself an agent? Get him. So I got you. You're on 3 shows. At the end of the day, I had 3 shows.
Can you briefly describe Four-Star Review? What's
Pardon?
the format of Four-Star Review?
Yeah, it was a variety show. Danny hated it. I was the head writer on that show. Danny hated it because he used all his nightclub material. And some of the shows were pretty good. They were good variety shows. It lasted 2 or 3 years.
Okay. And what about Ed Wynn? What was he like to work with?
Ed Wynn was one of my heroes. When I was a little boy, I used to get Ed Wynn on shortwave radio in those days. There were 2 broadcasts, and I would listen to the early broadcast from New York, and then there would be a broadcast a couple of hours later on the West Coast, for the West Coast. And we were eating dinner at the time, and I'd turn on the radio, and I'd say all the jokes before they were said. My parents thought I was a genius. Ed Wynn had a tick, and he had a little tick like that. And Dick Mack, the producer, had a tick like that. And one day, Dick Mack says, I hate it. And Ed Wynn says, or it was just the other way, he says, I don't like it. And Ed Wynn says, I hate it. We didn't know what to do. It was one of those rare moments when ticks were talking.
How long did you stay on the show?
As long as it was on the air, a couple of years.
And you said concurrently you were working on the Gary Moore show?
That was a daily show. That was in New York. When I came out here, I didn't do that.
How was working with Gary Moore?
Well, that was easy because he had several writers. You just turn in loose items that he could talk about. In those days, news items for the most part that he could make jokes about, and you'd give them the news item and the jokes, and that was it.
And then in 1953, you went to work on the Red Button show. Is that?
Yes, I had worked with Larry Gelbart, who, if you remember, the Red Button show was an overnight success. It was a sensation, and Gelbart was partially responsible for it. And he met his wife at my house, and while in between seasons, and they were going back to New York, he asked me if I wanted to come back and work on the show. I said, sure. So I went back with him and hardly ever saw him. He worked with another guy by the name of Hal Collins, and I worked with 2 other guys in uptown New York in their apartment, and I had an 8-week deal. And at the end of the 6th week, they had to give me another. I was making pretty good money, and the producer called me in and said, or it wasn't the producer, it was an attorney who handled Red. Said, we're not picking up your option. I said, why not? He says, well, I said, you may be getting rid of the best sketch writer in America. You have absolutely no idea what I do because I'm writing with these other guys, and it comes into you anonymously. So you don't know whether I can write or not. I said, you could be the best sketch writer in the world. We can't use you. You're making too much money. I said, what? He said, as you know, Red was an overnight sensation. And he gets very little money. So we have to take money from the writer's budget. I said, you're in trouble. I was the first of about 40 people who were hired and fired writers that second year. And he went right down the tubes. And he was crazy. You know, he was doing these things. No. In later years, he apologized.
You have to stop here to change the tape? And after you